Hello, good evening. Tonight I host a discussion with the wonderful Panama Hat on Peter Kemp's Minor of Trouble. Where was your first introduction to this book, Panama?
So my first introduction to this book was in some preliminary reading I did around the Spanish Civil War. I don't know if people know already, but I've done a lot of reading and a lot of study around the war in Spain. And so the name Peter Kemp sort of popped up occasionally as an example of a foreigner who fought for the nationalists. Because as people will be aware, the prevailing narrative is that the foreign legions that fought in Spain were all on the Republican side, kind of heroic columns of sort of working class men. That's the kind of prevailing liberal leftist narrative. But although I think on the whole, the Republicans did have quite the higher number of foreign volunteers, the nationalists also had their fair share. And so, yes, as I said, people kind of occasionally mentioned Peter Kemp to me. And I remember in 2018, 2019 or so, I looked up Peter Kemp and tried to find something on him. But all I found were a bunch of old books that were out of print, and surviving copies were, hundreds and hundreds of pounds. So I thought, maybe one day when I've got a bit of a bigger budget, I'll buy the books and see what it's all about. And then right when the whole coronavirus thing got going, people recommended me the Mystery Grove edition, which I think came out right around that time. Mystery Grove being the kind of dissident right publisher. So that's the copy I have. I also bought their copy of Storm of Steel around the same time, and so I read the book, and it was fascinating, far more than I thought it would be. I've read a great many war memoirs. I mean, the First and Second World Wars alone produced a gigantic number of ex troopies who kind of took to the pen. And a lot of the time, the trouble you have with them is that, you know, it's all perfectly gripping stuff, but a lot of the time their grasp of the war narrative as such is poor. And I know that sounds like a bit of an armchair complaint, um, when you're discussing people who have actually fought long enough in service to write about it. But really, what I'm trying to do is paint Mimer of Trouble in the best possible light, because I mean, for a start, the title, taken from the A. Hausman poem. I don't remember the title of it, but I remember the stanza that goes, "The thoughts of others were light and fleeting, of lovers meeting all luck and fame. Mine were of trouble, and mine was steady, so I was ready when the trouble came." So that immediately tells you that Kemp is fairly sort of literate, and he goes on to talk about how he was at Cambridge before the war, and all this kind of thing. So I was immediately grabbed by just how well written the memoir was. And then, as I said, not only is this just a kind of war memoir, this is the memoir of somebody who shows up in Spain without any knowledge of Spanish, manages to get into units which are not known for their acceptance of outsiders, especially not a Protestant as he is, when it's painted as a kind of, great Catholic struggle. And then goes on to command a unit in the Spanish Legion and actually have a meeting with Franco. So it was a far superior book than I was expecting, to put it lightly.
Hmm. Well, thank you for that. And yes, my version I have is also the Mystery Grove edition. Um, I actually became aware of this through Charlemagne because I know them. He likes to, well, he back then around that time he shared a lot of their work.
Mhm.
Because I've also read their edition of Always with Honour, which is the memoirs of General Wrangel, which were also
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah, and yeah, because it was very well timed me reading this because around the time that stuff was being shared is when you had all of the you had the year 2020 with everything that happened. Then I think a lot of people's
Yes.
perceptions of history and what's true and how things are told, people began to question that, and minor trouble is a good way to sort of red pill yourself on something like the Spanish Civil War, which is always told as, oh, the evil guys won, whereas if you read it, it's a lot more nuanced than that, in
Certainly.
my opinion.
Yes, it doesn't take a right winger to read about the history of the war and pretty quickly come to conclude who was honest and who was not. I won't use the terms good and bad because that won't quite do it justice, I think. But I find it hard to see how anybody could read about the history of Spain in that period and not sympathize with the nationalist faction if you're not, lost in the realms of Marxist ideology or something like that. Any intelligent person, I think, as Evelyn Waugh said, would sympathize with Franco.
I mean, you don't even have to sympathise with Franco. I mean, just sympathise with the people of Spain who had all these horrible atrocities forced upon them.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Okay. So let's start. So when the war breaks out in the summer of 1936, as I said, Kemp was a law student at Cambridge.
That's right.
And as I said, he knew absolutely no Spanish. So pretty I don't want to say crazy, but it's a very daring thing to do. But I suppose he was a young man, and
it's something that really speaks to me about the spirit of the age, and by the age I mean the kind of 1930s, the kind of jazz age, if you want. It really speaks of somebody who is willing to just up and go to a foreign land to fight for something they consider to be very important. It's really something of that specific time period that I don't think you would really get now. I mean, the closest thing we have is kind of all these kind of slightly odd Brits that are going off to fight in Ukraine. Obviously, I how there's that quote by Marx, everything happens, once as tragedy, once as farce. We're very much in the farce phase of that equation. Yeah, I think when you see that some of those efforts, but really, I mean, this is, and I'm talking about both the nationalist and Republican sympathizers here because it really is the same thing. No matter what side we sympathize with, it's a young man who believes in something hard enough to pick up a rifle and go and put his life on the line, and perhaps die far away from home in a foreign land for a war that he doesn't have to fight in. Whether it was because he was a communist or because he sympathized with Franco. It really does seem very far removed from now. But yes, anyway, to carry on with the chronology, yes, a law student at Cambridge in November 1936 when he's about to go. Just for context, the Spanish Civil War kicked off in July of that year with the July coup, which was an attempted coup by the army against the Spanish Republic, which had been established in 1931 after the fall of the monarchy, and had failed and had only taken small-ish parts of the country. I think initially it was about a third of the country they had, and over the course of that year, in the months between then and November, they'd quite significantly consolidated those gains. But yes, anyway.
Yes, yeah, their stronghold was in the north around Old Castile, Leon, Galicia.
Yes,
and
in Seville.
Because most of the and later when you say they consolidated, with the help of the Germans, they're able to move their Army of Africa because the nationalist support was strongly in the Spanish overseas colonies, and they were able to land in southern Spain and
that's
up
right.
some of there as well.
Essentially, the situation as it stood was that the Peninsular Army, or the army in mainland Spain itself, was largely made up of 2-year conscripts. But the Army of Africa, and that was about 70,000 men, and the Army of Africa, which was in Spain's territories in northern Morocco and in the Sahara, was about 30,000 men, and that was the professional core of the army. Those were, career soldiers, volunteers, professionals, many of whom were actually Moroccan colonial troops who had signed up to fight in the Spanish army, and were very, very effective, especially in close combat. So essentially, the reason that Hitler's help helped to Franco by giving him planes to airlift his troops, the reason that was so effective was because there was no other way for Franco to get these professional, hardened troops over to the mainland. And if he hadn't been able to do that, it may have turned out very, very differently.
Yes, because from what I recall, the Republicans had most of Spain's navy, so Franco certainly couldn't sail the troops over.
Yes, they had what part of the navy had gone over to the Republicans had blockaded the strait, so he couldn't ship his men across.
Mm-hmm. And also, from what Kemp tells, when the sort of civil war kicks off, most of the sailors mutiny and murder their officers, so the Spanish Navy was not really in a good operable state.
No, the navy was quite well infiltrated by kind of leftist movements. So yes, a lot, as you said, a lot of the sailors on ships mutinied, killed their officers, and tried to take over. But the issue with that was that one, just they were crews of these ships that didn't really do a very good job of sailing them without officers, without experienced officers, which any ship needs. And they also were considered illegal ships internationally. So Britain and France and all the other powers considered these ships crewed by mutineers to be in breach of international agreements where, you can't allow mutineered ships to go around. So the Royal Navy basically put most of these ships at gunpoint and ordered them to surrender, which most of them did. And then the crews were taken prisoner. So the naval situation is complicated, but yes, essentially for our purposes now, at that immediate moment, the Republicans had control of the Straits of Gibraltar. So Franco couldn't get across by sea. So he used a fleet of Junkers trimotor planes given by Adolf Hitler.
Yes, indeed, and a bit about the Royal Navy making those of these ships surrender. That was something I actually wasn't aware of, so that's very interesting.
Yes.
Okay, and so what I want to do is there's some passages from this book which I'm going to want to read and discuss throughout this whole stream. There's one I want to read now, which is sort of to do with Kemp's motivations. So here we go. So there's a bit where he's with a friend in the car driving to the port to depart to Spain. So Peter, said Hill suddenly.
Could you give me the page number just before we begin so I can keep up with you?
Oh, sure. Page 6.
Okay.
Yeah, it's near the bottom.
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, yeah. So Peter, said Hill suddenly, what the devil is this really an aid of? Meaning what? Well, all I know at the moment is that you're going to Spain, that you're going there to fight, and that you're going to fight against the government or the Reds or whatever you like to call them. Just why are you going, and why particularly do you choose to fight for the insurgents? Or don't you really mind which side you fight for? Certainly, I answered tartly. I mind very much which side I fight for. Nothing in the world would induce me to join the other side. Moreover, I added pompously, you know the interest I took in politics at Cambridge. Yes, I remember. You were too conservative for the Conservative Association, so you formed a splinter union of your own, he grinned. I don't care about politics myself. We've had too many politicians in the family. Still, if you hold strong political views, I dare say it's quite a good idea to go and fight for them. My reasons aren't entirely political. In fact, I think the political motive is about the least important, except that it determines what side I chose. You see, quite frankly, this war has broken out at a particularly opportune moment for me. I've finished my time at Cambridge and taken my degree, but I haven't yet started on a career, and I have still some months to play with before I commit myself irrevocably to a job that will tie me down for the rest of my life. This war isn't likely to last more than 6 months. It's a splendid chance for me to go out on my own, see a strange country, and get to know its people and language. Also to learn something about modern warfare. God knows that's likely to be useful enough. Above all, it's a chance to learn to look after myself in difficulty and danger. Up till now, I've never really had to do anything for myself. I mean, I've always known where my next meal was coming from, and that, provided I looked both ways before crossing the street, I'm not likely to be in any danger. But there's another thing, just as important. If you've read the news reports published at the beginning of this war, before the imposition of censorship, you'll know that there was appalling scenes of mob violence throughout the government territory. Wherever the Reds took control, priests and nuns were shot simply because they were priests or nuns. Ordinary people murdered just because they had little money or property. It is to fight against that sort of thing that I'm going to Spain. I stopped for breath after this recital. Reviewing them now, I find my words embarrassingly naive. Perhaps I really was trying to justify my decision to myself, to convince myself for the last time that it was the right one. On that stormy November morning, I did not know what most of us had learned since, that you do not practice to go to war for only a few months, and that it is much easier to get into a war than to get out of it. At least, I finished, the experience is bound to be useful, and in any way, I have nothing to lose. So, after reading that, you can sort of see, he's sort of very young and idealistic. It's only going to be a few months. Kind of reminds me of World War One, where they said it'll be all over by Christmas.
Mm. Yes, that's certainly true. It's, I mean, I think the naivety is kind of is unavoidable for a man like him. You're a young man going off to fight something for the first time. But something that stands out to me in that passage is this. If I just find my place again, his father says to him, "If you hold strong political views, I dare say it's quite a good idea to go and fight for them." And I quite it strikes me this moment where a father who clearly isn't particularly keen on his son going off to fight in some uprising in Spain, but who nevertheless says, "Well, it's obviously the honourable, manly thing to do to go and fight for your views if you really believe in them." And I think again that's another thing that we've perhaps lost now. It's very difficult for me to imagine a modern father saying that to their son, possibly because things have just become less valuable. Things matter less. All these people in uproar about how horrible the situation in Ukraine is, and how evil Putin is, but you don't see them queuing up to go and fight, do you? There's a lot more kind of slackness, and those people in the 1930s on either side probably wouldn't have bleated and cried about how horrible it was in Spain. If they cared about it that much, they would have gone and fought. Simple as. You don't stand around whinging. You either keep your head down or you go and fight for what you believe in. Certainly a more honourable time.
Yes, and as many of us discussed in our circles, it's the feminization of our culture.
Yes.
There's far less masculinity and testosterone than there used to be. And another example, mentioning his father, because his father also offers Kemp his old Mannica rifle. I mean, how many fathers would do that today in Britain?
Yes, exactly. Well, how many fathers would have a rifle to give to their sons? I mean, this was back at a time when the population at large was trusted to be armed, which of course now they're not. I was reading a Chesterton biography some time ago, and it mentioned how because on the night after his wedding, before the honeymoon, he walked into a shop and purchased a revolver. And it noted how back then you could go into any tobacconist, any corner shop, any kind of general goods store in any town or sort of city in the UK, and you would be able to buy guns. Like you wouldn't have to show a license or anything else. There were just guns for sale, and that was just a perfectly normal thing. It was not something that many people bought, and when they did, it was always for a good reason. But it was just incredible to me, this idea that you could just waltz into a shop and buy a weapon like that. When of course now we're so far removed from that high trust society, so far removed from anything anything even approximating a high trust society. You know, we're not even trusted to take care of our own health. You know, as we saw over the last few years, or trusted to speak our minds openly. So it's a far cry.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so after this, he gets on the boat. His sort of parents wave him off, and he travels to Spain. So when he actually goes there, he has to go a little bit undercover. He has to pretend to be a courier in order to get over the frontier, essentially. And there's a bit of milling about at the initially when he's trying to actually find an officer who actually recruits him, because initially he decides to serve with the raquetes. And would like to we'll go over the raquetes Panama.
What? So an illustration of what they are, or
yeah, we'll look at a brief overview.
well, the raquetes, I should say are. I think some of them do actually still exist, but the raquetes were militia units, or basically fighting units of riflemen that belonged to the Carlists. And the Carlists were a kind of ultra-Catholic monarchist faction of the Civil War, with a history going all the way back to the 1800s, in which there was a dynastic struggle between the supporters of Queen Isabella II, who tended to draw support from liberals and progressives, and Don Carlos, who drew support from more conservative elements of society, who kind of wanted to do away with parliamentarianism, do away with liberalism, and go back to this kind of very heavily regionalized, deeply Catholic kind of municipal vision of a society, in which rather than a constitution, every region, every town, every city has its own municipal customs and codes of laws. That kind of thing. That's kind of a brief illustration. And Carlists fought 3 enormous civil wars in the 1800s. Unfortunately, they lost all of them. And but the Carlists as a movement survived, and they had these units of militia called raquetes. And very often, if you were a raquete, you would have your rifle at home, and you would have your red beret, which the Carlists famously wear, and you would have your sort of rifle above the fireplace. And then when you died, you would pass that rifle on to your son, who would then also be a raquete and would, sort of report for drill and do training and marksmanship and things. So when the Civil War actually broke out, the Carlist raquetes were some of the few people in Spain that were actually ready. They had guns, even if they were very outdated and worn and from another age, and they had a belief in God, being such ultra Catholics, that they were ready to die against the godless atheism of the Republic and Marxism. And they mainly come from the region of Navarre, which is a sort of central north in Spain, south of the Pyrenees. And there's a quote by a Spanish socialist who fought on the Republican side and survived. And he recorded that the thing he feared the most on the battlefield, it wasn't the shelling, it wasn't the wire or any of that, or any kind of risk like that. The thing he feared most was a Carlist right after the Carlist had received communion. Because of course, when he received communion, he was ready to go to heaven, for God. So I think that's perhaps the closest thing we Christians have to a jihad. It's a shame we don't have a bit more of that kind of attitude, but yeah.
It's interesting because that reminds me of when I was reading about the Carolians of the Swedish Empire, because they had a very similar thing. They would have like these chaplains who would do a religious ceremony with, and then afterwards they would fight absolutely fanatically.
Yes.
Yeah. Because also Kemp talks about this, several of the raquete units actually have like a padre, which is like a
yes,
priest.
There would always be a priest with them. Yes, they would be very close. The clergy would go with them to the front, and they would say mass several times a day. And they would kind of, the again, I can't stress the Carlists are the most fanatical Catholics that are involved in this.
And to illustrate that, there's another small passage I want to read. This is page 10, towards the bottom.
Yes, I see.
Okay, so I could see the square forts on a hill to my left, with the red and gold colours of nationalist Spain floating from its walls. The nationalists had paid for their victory with some of their best blood. The gallant and devoted Carlists from Navarre and Alava, who had rallied to a man to Mola's colours on the outbreak of war. Boys of 15 and old men of 70 alike rose to defend La Fay and La Tourlichon, following in the steps of their ancestors, who had fought under Zamulala Karuki. I'm sorry if I butchered that. In the last century.
Yeah, it's quite tough to pronounce some of these, the Catalan and Navarrese names, yes.
Mm-hmm. They, with no military training whatever, were taught how to load and fire a rifle as they were brought by the lorry to the front. They were shot down in hundreds on the almost impregnable slopes around San Marshal. So again, you see from that, these men were just died in their droves for what they believed in, and again,
they were ready. Yes.
Young boys and even old men who, I mean, because the last Carlist War actually, I think, was the 1817s. So
yes, I think that was around the time of the Third Carlist War.
Just wondering if maybe some of those old men maybe fought in that one possibly, or maybe they might have been a bit young.
Yes. And yes, the mention of La Fe, which is the faith, and La Tradición, which is the kind of on the surface it means the Salic law, which is the understanding that women will not inherit the throne, which is what happened under Isabel II. But it also refers to as that what I described earlier, the broader medieval traditions of Spain, as opposed to kind of liberal progressive ones.
Well, I will say Kemp does note, and we need to sort of say this, I think, in balance, that
yes.
If you go back in Spanish history, there actually had been female monarchs, like Isabella I, very famously, who was married to Ferdinand of Aragon.
Yes.
So essentially, so you have, obviously it wasn't very common because most medieval monarchies tended to be have male kings preferably, but on occasion there would be a female. It's only when the Bourbons come to power in the beginning of the 18th century that they actually bring in French Salic law. So Kemp sort of says it's a bit hypocritical because there had been a tradition of female monarchs, but I completely get why the Carlists want to defend Salic law.
Well, I think the again, as you said, the issue with that initial rise of Carlism is that the Salic law was never really practiced in Spain. It was nominal. It's kind of it's a bit of a legal fiction that you could argue that because the Bourbons brought it in, but it was never an official thing. So, I mean, for me, my sympathies for the Carlists isn't anything to do with the Salic law. It's just their defense of traditional Spain, their defense of the traditional way of life, the defense of the traditional political structures without kind of modernist progressive meddling, and their willingness to fight and die, and of course their fanatical belief in Christ. That to me is one of the most admirable things that a man can have.
Yes, certainly, and I think in that even goes back further, to the days of the Reconquista, when they were driving out the Moors and retaking it for Christianity.
Indeed, it does. Yes, the long martial tradition in Spain. It's also worth going back to the Napoleonic invasion at the beginning of the 1800s, where Napoleon's troops that they were ostensibly allied with Spain, so they were stationed all over the country, and in a kind of attempted coup, they tried to annex Spain into the Napoleonic Empire and overthrow the king. And what ensued was one of the most brutal civil wars to ever be fought, if you read the accounts of it. And it was echoed again in the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. Same kind of thing, brutal guerrilla warfare, with horrible things happening to troops unlucky enough to be caught by bands of fighters, which I won't describe now. But yes, it's quite terrible.
Well, so speaking of the sort of the ferocity and the tenacity of the raquetes, so Kemp is eventually able to get enrolled into a unit, a cavalry unit of raquetes. So he was actually going to be on horseback, though by this time cavalry, they didn't just charge in as in the old glory days. They all were armed with rifles and pretty much operated as sort of mobile infantry. But also to sort of show how tough the Carlists were, there's actually a very small description he does of them. This is on page 31. So, darkness was falling as we left the town. On our way out, we overtook a column of raquete cavalry, wild-looking men, dark and squat, with black beards. So you can always see from that description that they're wild-looking men that are dark and squat. So these are clearly very tough warriors.
Yes. And there is actually he does actually take part in a cavalry charge at one point. Unfortunately, it's rather an anticlimax because his unit of cavalrymen who are on patrol, his squadron, I should say, see what they think is enemy infantry, a small, loosely organized group of enemy infantry, just on the other side of a hill. So they all draw their swords and charge, and they get there, and it's a couple of civilian farmers, I think, who are just in the fields minding their own business.
There's some goats.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So it's a bit anticlimax, but he did officially take part in a cavalry charge, you can say, even if it didn't go anywhere.
Yeah. And I've got here another description of this is of a Carlist officer called Captain Baron. This is page 33. In the evening, we saw Captain Baron of the cavalry, a very quiet man whose age I was unable to guess because of the greater part of his face was hidden beneath an enormous pointed black beard in the style of the heroes of the Carlist Wars. These beards were much affected by the raquetes, both at the front and in the rear areas, giving the wearers an expression at once of dignity and extreme ferocity.
Yes. Well, I mean, the that look is very fierce, isn't it? The great heavy beard of the warrior.
Yeah, certainly, and in conjunction with the previous description of them being dark and squat, they certainly are a very fierce bunch.
Yes, indeed they are. I mean, in combat, as I said, they would be given communion and then head into battle. So literally a religious fervor. If we die now, we die and go to heaven.
Certainly, and so due to the nature of them mostly living in the rural countryside, most of them were of I guess we could say like peasant stock, even though maybe a bit outdated by this point in Spanish history, but you know what I mean. They're very rural. They're not urban by any means.
Oh no! They all would have come from the heavy, hilly mountain country out in the north, or most of the Carlists.
Yes. Yes. So while he's serving with them, so we mentioned the cavalry charge that ended up being a bit farcical. So by January 1937, the company he's attached to, and I believe they call it a bandera, is the Spanish expression.
Yes, the yes, just means a small sort of platoon of troops.
Yes, so they're sent to defend a position in Madrid because at this point in the war, Franco desperately wants to take Madrid because it's the capital. And it's very bitterly fought over because the Republicans send most of their foreign legionaries to the city to help defend it, and they famously have that propaganda expression, that "nan non passa," they shall not pass.
Yes,
which they recycled from the French have done. So as part of that, Kemp's bandera has to defend a part of the university town called Carabanchel Bajo.
Yes, well, so in the early months of the war, As Hitman said, the nationalists were very keen to take Madrid early on to get a quick end to the war. But Madrid, the angle they attacked it from, made it very hard to attack and easy to defend. And there was this enormous complex called the University City, and that's literally what it was. It was a gigantic educational complex of universities and huge residential halls that had been built sometime in the early 1920s. And there was sort of room-to-room fighting. And they got bogged down because the brunt of the nationalist attack was being carried by the African troops, by the Moroccans, whose sort of ideal zone was the open plains and sort of open, wide, flat terrain because they're from Morocco. So they're very good at fighting in that kind of environment. But you put them into urban warfare, I think most of those troops would never have seen a capital European city the size of Madrid before. Certainly nothing like it. They may have seen the Spanish colonial towns, Ceuta or Melilla in Morocco, but nothing like this. So it's not even a matter of them being not skilled in urban warfare. They've never even really been in an environment like this before, most of them. So they really do get stuck in, and they find themselves trapped in the university town. But then sort of Franco has a change of heart, and his strategy for the rest of the war is advancing into all the other regions of Spain before they take Madrid, which of course they do in 1939.
Yeah, so after holding this sort of this section of this university town for a while, the unit are eventually moved away elsewhere, and what would be one of I guess you could say Kemp's lucky sort of close shaves is, I think, a week after they move out, another unit that's in the same building gets completely blown up by artillery.
Yes. Well, I mean, war is like that. You often read accounts of it. It's only a matter of you being in the next tank, in the next trench, in a house just before or just after. It's if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and a bomb lands on you, it's over. A lot of the war memoirs I've read mention this kind of weird twist of fate. This constant closeness to death, this constant, there but for the grace of God, go I kind of thing.
And it's not long after this, there's some quite sad news as Kemp receives a letter that his father, who's normally very healthy, has been taken gravely ill, and so he's really unsure what to do. And then I think not long after, he gets another letter asking him to come home because he's basically dying. So he hurries home as quickly as he can, but unfortunately not quite quick enough. And he arrives the day after his father's funeral, which must be absolutely awful for anyone, not only losing a father, but to miss the funeral as well.
Yes. So it hits this is the age without our kind of instant communications. If you want to reach your son who happens to be fighting in Spain, you've got to send a letter or try and get a telegram to him, and it's going to take a while. And also, if you're in the middle of a war, you can't exactly sling your rifle over your back and head home to Britain, on the next plane or something. So yes, very tragic, but kind of an occupational hazard if you're going to get involved with those kinds of things.
But yes, he's able to get a salvo condato, I believe, which is permission to leave from the raquetes to go home. And that's something that surprised me, is how accommodating the nationalists were to Kemp's personal situation, because they let him leave here to go home, and then he comes back. He's there for like a month, and then his mother asks him to come back again to help with some legal matters that come out of his father's death. So he leaves and goes back again, and every time then they give him I was just surprised at how accommodating they were. I was expecting the military to be like, no, you're in the army, you fight for us.
Yes, exactly.
And speaking of his mother, she was very stressed as well, because obviously losing her husband, but also her son's off fighting in some foreign war, and also
be killed at any minute.
Brother was an officer. Yeah, and also Kemp's older brother was an officer in the Royal Navy. So though it was peacetime, obviously there were dangers whenever you're in any kind of military role.
Mm-hmm.
So after he returns after helping his mother, so when I did mention his brother, when he actually does go home the second time, he's actually able to get a lift from his brother on his ship, the HMS Neptune, which was later unfortunately sunk during the war, and his brother dies, which also was a nasty blow to him, but that came a few years later.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and
yes,
when
and
he comes back,
just a note on that. Peter Kemp went on to fight in the British Special Service up till the 50s through World War II. Yes, the SOE, and he wrote memoirs about all of it. He wrote quite a collection of books about all these kind of operations.
And yes, the other. So this is Mine with Trouble about the Spanish Civil War. Then there's Arms for there's No Colours or Crest, which is about his experience in the SOE during the war, and then you've got Arms for Oblivion, which is his sort of post-war experience dealing with a lot of the sort of colonial unrest problems in East Asia.
Mm-hmm.
So when he comes back the second time after helping his mother, there's a bit of a political crisis that unfolds. So I'm just going to read another bit. So this is page 67 towards the bottom.
Yes. Okay.
Right. So I arrived in Spain on April 21st in the middle of a political crisis. The only public announcements of it were first an official statement that Senor Hedia, the leader of the Falange, was under arrest. Secondly, a decree amalgamating the raquetes and the Falange and abolishing all other political parties. The new organization was to be known as the Falange Española Tradicionalista y de las Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista. And in English, that's something like the traditionalist Spanish phalanx for the offensive National Syndicalist Junta.
Yes.
I've got that right, Panama, or
that's right. Yeah.
Or close enough.
Yeah, I mean, but it's essentially.
What I do find amusing though is because I think, because I think before the merge, the Carlist party was just called the Traditionalist Communion, whereas the Falange was the Falange Española, but minus the traditionalist bit was added afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially Franco consolidating his power around one party to avoid factionalism.
Yes, and added, the Spaniards with their irrepressible love of ridicule, de los grandes expresos Europos, parties with more divergent political views than the raquetes and the Falange could scarcely be imagined. Writing of this magnificent harlequin, Senor de Madariaga says it was as if the President of the United States organized the Republican Democratic Socialist Communist League of the Daughters of the American Revolution.
Yes,
in hopes of unifying American politics. Either the Falange or the raquetes would have to dominate. The skill and intrigue of the former and the political ineptitude of the latter made the outcome certain. The raquetes ceased to exert any serious influence on Spanish politics.
Yes, it's true. The Carlists had been politically lame for quite some time before the Civil War. But yes, their inability to really form a modern party or have any kind of modern expression really did hamper them. But yes, both the Phalange or the Falange, I should say, and the Carlists kind of fell into the background, and Franco took prominence as the caudillo or the strongman. But of course, the Falange would be sort of disestablished by Franco himself later down the line, whereas the Carlists as a movement still exist now, although they've kind of taken this very infiltrated leftist sort of outlook these days. It's very, very cringe. But yes.
Oh dear. That's sad to hear. Yes, and what's also interesting with this whole movement, also rather this political crisis, is because Kemp talks about this a little bit later, but essentially it's believed that the Germans actually had a hand in this in a potential coup where the Falange were going to try and overthrow Franco and replace the leader of the nationalists with their own figure, and Franco is able to catch on to this, and
Yeah.
hence why Hidia was arrested, and essentially Franco, though the Germans keep helping the nationalists throughout the war, Franco tries to avoid taking too much assistance from them, and it also explains his caution towards Hitler after the Civil War.
Well, it should be. I mean, as it actually says in the book, in the opposite page, I think. Franco was from Galicia, so he was a Gallego, and they are famous for being very inscrutable and obstinate, and they will do anything to get their own way. And no matter what happens, you can't make them out. So, a common saying in Spain is that if you meet a Galician on the staircase, you can't tell if he's going up or down. Basically, it's that kind of thing. And Franco totally exemplified that. You know, when Hitler came to meet with him during the Second World War, he said afterwards that he would rather have 2 of his teeth pulled out every week than have to meet with Franco ever again, because he could be that awkward. And it was never exactly clear what he wanted or what he wanted to do, but that politically served him very well because you couldn't predict him.
No, absolutely, and so not long after this, there's a really interesting sort of episode that Kemp describes, and it sort of sheds a bit of light on a very lesser known aspect of the nationalist support, which is the Irish support for the nationalists. So I'm just going to read another little excerpt. So this is on the next page from the previous bit I read. So this is page 69. Less beautiful among the sights of Salamanca at this time, but it seemed scarcely less firmly established, was the figure of General O'Duffy, who commanded the Irish Brigade. I met him through his ADC, Captain Meade, a charming man, half Irish and half Spanish, with all the tact and patience that his job required. The General was sitting at a table in a corner of the lounge in the Grand Hotel, a bottle of whisky in front of him. With him were Meade, another officer of his staff, and the rector of the Irish College at Salamanca. Meade, whom I had met before, came over to my table and asked me to join them. As we crossed the room, he whispered to me, "Please be careful what you say to the General. I'm afraid I must tell you that he loathes all Englishmen."
Well, the story of the Irish Brigade in the Spanish Civil War is really a topic unto itself. It's really quite a wild ride to read about. So obviously, there's a long history between Ireland and Spain. Throughout it, because of their shared Catholicism mainly. So as it mentions, there was an Irish college, so scholars and kind of priests in training from both countries would do exchanges and things. And this goes all the way back to I think at least the 1600s, certainly.
Yes, because there was a unit of the Spanish Royal Guard called the Guardia Irlandesa, which is the Irish Guard.
Yes, that's right. Yes, and there were also Irish units in the French Royal Army as well.
The wild geese that fled after the Battle of the Boyne.
That's right. Yes. And I must point out that the Irish Brigade in the Spanish Civil War were I don't think there's a word I can really use to sum it up. Slightly chaotic. They got drunk all the time. They were unreliable in combat. They got into friendly fire incidents. And their effect on the war was, or their effect on the nationalist effort was actually so frightful that the commander of the Foreign Legion, I believe, ordered them to withdraw. And Owen O'Duffy was also a terrible leader who alienated people. He couldn't get along with any of his Spanish counterparts, or even many of the men in his own unit. So yes, it was not a good showing from the Irish contingent.
Yes, and as Kemp describes further down on the page, essentially, so O'Duffy had been a former chief of police of the Irish Free State, and he was very much a bit of a political figure. And I think the main reason for the Irish Brigade being in Spain was him trying to shore up his political position by trying to support the nationalists, and then I think try to win glory and then come home and use that to help him domestically. But that didn't quite work out for him.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So after that episode, so also before we mentioned General Mola, not long after this, he actually dies, which even further weakens the Carlist cause, because he was the general that was responsible for the initial sort of coup attempt that kicked the whole civil war off, and he very much was the main leader for the Carlists. And also around this time, Kemp is attached to a new unit of raquetes, the Tercio de Nuestra Senora de Bugona, which was later reformed into the 2nd Navarre Brigade, led by the Colonel Munoz Grande, and who, interestingly, later during the Second World War, was the commander of the Azul Division, or the Blue Division. That was the nationalist Spanish and foreign unit that fought on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And also, speaking of Navarre, something I meant to mention earlier is when you mentioned about the Carlists having strong support there. There was also a substantial amount of Republican support. So I actually think the Basque County was actually split in two, being roughly equal nationalist and Republican. And I think there was a quote by a Basque nationalist that the true tragedy of the Spanish Civil War wasn't Spaniard fighting Spaniard, but Basque fighting Basque.
Yes. Yes. That's yes. So I remember that specific bit.
Okay. And so later on with his new division, there's an incident where, after an offensive against Santander, which is a major city in sort of northern Spain, Kemp has to bluff his way past some enemy troops. So there's another little interesting episode that I want to read from. So this is page 81.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So by 3:30, I had seen enough, and so I decided to return to Bilbao. My new Citroen was full of oil and petrol, obviously in preparation for a long journey. On the outskirts of town, I stopped to ask an Italian sentry if he knew whether the coast road was clear of the enemy, of whom a large number must have been trapped between Santander and our troops advancing from the east. He assured me it was clear. For the first 25 miles, the road was deserted. I saw neither human beings nor animals. The car went beautifully, leaving the promontory with Santora and its lighthouses on my left. I drove on without incident until I approached the little fishing port of Laredo. The outskirts and the narrow streets of the town were thronged with men in blue overalls and black berets, carrying rifles slung from their shoulders, pistols and grenades at their belts. It was only when the press in the street forced me to slow down to a walking pace that I realised who these were. I had driven right into the middle of the Republican army, or a portion of it which had been cut off while rapid advance to Santander. It was impossible to turn the car. My only hope was to drive on as unconcernedly as I could and hope that I would be taken for the advance guard of the victorious nationalists, come to accept their surrender. Of course, it would be too bad for me if they had no mind to surrender. Wearing my scarlet beret with the silver fleur-de-lis and carrying a large 9mm automatic, I was only too obviously an enemy. Ironically, I was reminded of the words of a charming little song from this town which our raquetes used to sing. Yo no te quiero, chica. Yo no te quiero, no. Porque los mi amores son de Laredo son. Do you have any idea what that is in English, Panama?
I could roughly translate, but I think the meaning would be a bit lost on me. Basically, it's something like I don't know you, girl. I don't know you, no. Because something my loves son de Laredo son. I'd have to look it up. I can only vaguely get the meaning. Something like that. But I will look that up as we go on. But this whole thing about him driving into the Republican Army, we tend to imagine that war has these kind of concrete front lines, you know. We tend to imagine that all war is a bit like the Western Front, where you've got, you know, stock still lines of trenches 10 feet apart, where, you know, you're in one side, the enemy's in the other. But in actual fact, there's often a lot of chaos and confusion at the front end of it. And there are many similar stories to this, just trying to find somewhere, marching around, driving around, flying around, and you just blunder into the enemy. What we consider to be the front line. It's not quite, I think, how war tends to play out these days. Not if you've got a kind of mobile war. What instead you have is kind of areas under your control, areas under the enemy control, and the distance between them can be anything. And of course, there's also there isn't any such thing as a battlefield. Life goes on all throughout war. So especially in a civil war like Spain, but in all sorts of wars, you hear stories. Say here where like he mentions the press in the streets, the hotels, and the civilians and the fishermen carrying on their work. It's all these people are just going about their lives in the midst of the war. In the midst of sort of the troops fighting around them, and that seems to be a recurring theme whenever you read about war.
Yes, and with the times that the war was in, and some other conflicts around then, the line sort of between military and civilian starts to be blurred, as numerous atrocities are committed, and the Spanish Civil War was no exception. Considering some of the things we mentioned already, like nuns and priests were like crucified or buried or taped, or even I saw one that was circulating around on Twitter, I think the other week, of like a nun corpse that had been unearthed and put on like display.
Yes, that was something that went on. The Republicans would desecrate any kind of Christian sites they could find. There's a very famous picture called "The Execution of Christ," where they're doing a kind of firing squad takedown of a large statue of the crucifixion, and things like that. It's the accounts are just horrific. Some of the desecrations, and yes, it was quite common for nuns, the bodies of nuns and saints to be disinterred and hung up for display. Just horrible things.
And so just want to, there's a bit more. So now I knew something of what the former occupants of my Citroen must have felt when we stopped them outside Santander. However, I forced my feature into what I hoped would seem a confident grin and drove on. Sounding my horn to clear the way, the milicianos stared at me curiously, but no one tried to stop me until I was beginning to get clear of the town. Then a couple of men with white armbands signalled me to stop. Though without pointing their rifles at me, as I passed them I called out in what I trusted was an authoritative voice, "Tercio de Nuestra Senora de Begona," and drove on. In the driving mirror I saw their faces gaping in blank astonishment. I tried this formula on 2 subsequent occasions with the same success, but I confess I felt relieved when at last I met the advanced units of our mixed brigades near Castro Urdiales. It was with some astonishment that I heard the BBC News announced the following day that 10,000 Basque Republican troops had taken up defensive positions on the road between Santander and Castro Urdiales. So as you can see, it wasn't just a few units; it was thousands of men he managed to escape past, essentially.
Yes, really, it was through an entire sort of heavy line he'd go through.
And so after this event is when Kemp decides to leave the raquetes. So though his initial sort of enthusiasm and sympathy for or empathy for their cause, he ultimately decides to leave them because he realizes essentially that though they've got the zeal and they've got the morale, they're not professional soldiers. They are ultimately a militia, and so he kind of wants to join a much more. Yes, and so he kind of, because he's now got a taste for soldiering and fighting. Because what I should mention is that by this point, he starts in the raquetes as a enlisted man, even though, because when he'd been to Cambridge, he'd had OTC certificates, which essentially meant that in the event of a war, he could be given the rank of officer in the British Army. But because he couldn't speak Spanish, commanders insisted that he join as an enlisted man. But eventually, he's able to rapidly rise. So by the time he leaves the raquetes, he's an alferez or a lieutenant. And when he moves over to the Spanish Foreign Legion, he is able to impress them enough that they let him keep his rank as he moves into them.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, and no, the Spanish Foreign Legion were one of the most elite and veteran units of the nationalist army. And there's actually a little excerpt earlier where he does describe them. So I'm just going to go back to that. So that's page 16. That's it. So the Foreign Legion, or Tercio, was founded in the early 1920s by General Milan Astre with the help of some of the ablest officers of the Spanish army, including General then Major Franco. Its inspiration derived from two sources: historically and romantically from the tercios of the Duke of Alba in the 16th century, the corps of the Spanish infantry in the days when Spanish discipline was a byword in Europe; militarily and practically from the French Foreign Legion, whose methods were studied firsthand by Milan Astre and his assistants. But the Spanish Foreign Legion differed in one important respect from the French. It was composed almost entirely of Spaniards, although prior to the Civil War it was the only unit of the Spanish army in which foreigners could enlist. Service was for a minimum of 5 years and was confined to Spanish possessions overseas. During the Civil War, its strength increased from 6 banderas or battalions to 20. Even then, about 90% of the rank and file and nearly all of the officers were Spaniards, the remainder being Portuguese, with a few French and some Germans and White Russians. So just illustrating that, as I said, they let Kemp keep his rank when he moved over to them. So that's even more impressive considering it's a very elite regiment that was almost completely starved by Spaniards.
Yes, quite ironic actually, because it was meant to be the Spanish equivalent of the Foreign Legion, the French Foreign Legion, which has sort of men from all over the world. But within a few years, I mean, it was pretty much entirely Spanish, because as I said before, what the Spanish army needed wasn't a Foreign Legion; it needed a professional corps of troops. It didn't want to rely on unmotivated conscripts who hated the government they were serving for anymore. It needed men that could be trusted to wage war effectively. So, it didn't really matter that it was a mostly Spanish unit, as long as those men were committed, which they were. There was also quite a lot of desperadoism. There were a number of men in the unit were ex-criminals, or men who had been offered service in the Legion against a jail sentence. There were some men who were criminals in Portugal or France or other countries or Africa, and had sort of fled to Spain and then joined the Legion to sort of because if they did that, the Spanish authorities would sort of turn a blind eye to having foreign criminals in. But it must be said that, according to certain accounts I've read, those men made the ablest fighters. Because the discipline in the Legion was so fierce, you didn't want to risk being a deserter or a pilferer or a malingerer. That would not end well for you.
No, certainly not. Well, speaking of criminals being good soldiers, remember the most of the British army of the 18th century were essentially criminals, weren't they? So.
Yes, as Wellington famously said, scum, pillagers and thieves.
And very fine ones at that as well. He added, I believe.
Yes, he said, "I don't know what effect these men will have on the enemy, but by God, they frighten me."
Yes. And so there is a description of the Foreign Legion again, which is on page 55 near the bottom. So, after dark, and bandera of the Foreign Legion formed up outside, dark, hard-bitten, grim-looking soldiers with a tremendous pride in their bearing. They were singing the two great Legion songs, El Himno del Legionario and El Novia de la Muerte, thrilling tunes that moved us all as we heard them chanted with such spirit by these men who were about to die. Indeed, many of them were dead. Within 24 hours, at dawn, they went into action, nearly 600 strong, to force the crossing of the Jarama. By the evening, there were barely 200 left. So one thing I guess you could say they share in common with the raquetes is the complete sort of fearlessness and fanaticism, but less sort of Catholic and traditional, but more just pure a brilliant soldier.
Let me illustrate this here, because the Spanish Legion, as you mentioned, was founded by a Spanish army officer called Millán Astray, who I can honestly say, after having read about him for some time now, has or had a pretty much sexual fixation on death. I mean, it was terrifying fixation on death, and I don't mean that lightly when I say it was a sexual thing. I mean it was clearly ingrained in him, this kind of fetishization of death. He was obsessed with it totally. He himself had been wounded a whole number of times. He was missing an arm. He was missing an eye. He had been hit by all kinds of shrapnel and wounds and everything. And there's a film from a few years ago called Minetras. I think it's Minetras dura la guerra or something like that. But it basically means whilst at war. And it's a very interesting film because it shows the coup that started the Civil War from the perspective of the nationalist generals. It's very, very, very good. Doesn't seem to be very known in the English-speaking world yet, but I highly recommend it. I found it quite good. I don't know about the exact historical accuracy. I would have to do a sort of deeper, sort of frame-by-frame check on that. But there's a scene in it where Millán Astray is sort of sat with some squaddies and is sort of, regaling them with a story, and he says, so there I was in the hospital after my arm had been blown off, and I got a telegram from the king, and it said, "Congratulations on your 6th glorious injury. Stop. Eagerly await the 7th. Stop." That kind. This kind of machismo, bravery, and kind of sexual fetishization of death. In fact, one of the songs you read out there, it actually translates into English as "the bridegrooms of death." The men in the Legion considered themselves basically already claimed by death. Bridegrooms of death, married to death. Death is part of their sort of everyday experience. And the battle cry of the Legion was "Viva la muerte!" Long live death. It's really quite disturbing if you read about the history of the Legion. It's a very, very disturbing. The early days, especially, as I said, like this unit with this. And I know I must, I'm repeating myself a lot, but I'm really trying to hammer the point home. This unit led by this commander with this sexual fixation on death. There's a reason they were so effective in combat and were, had such a reputation.
And yes, and so sort of speaking of the sort of obsession with death, I mean, this is not the first military unit to do this. So obviously, you've got the in German, the Prussian army, you had the Death's Head Hussars, who the Totenkopfs and the black uniforms, and then later, I think the looking at another sort of 20th century sort of right wing regime in Romania, you had the Iron Guard. They too, I believe, had a very similar fixation on death too.
Yes, though I would single out the Spanish Legion in particular because they actually, regularly went into very brutal hand-to-hand combat. There is something particularly horrifying about them as a unit. Though I do applaud their martial spirit.
Also, Millán Astray, he sounds a little bit like a Spanish Adrian Carton de Wyatt, if you're familiar with him.
Yes, I am familiar with him. I would say Carton de Wyatt was a much more sort of honourable British-style soldier, whereas Millán Astray was just insane. It's absolutely nuts. So, yeah.
But maybe you think you've got to be a bit bonkers to keep going into war and keep getting injured the way both those men did. So
yes, you do.
Right. Okay. So Yeah, so when he's assigned to the Legion, so that he's let in, there's an incident where he does annoy one of the officers, where they asked him to come back at like sharp 8 in the morning, and he goes to stay in like a hotel, and because he's sleeping so soundly, the landlady doesn't want to wake him, and so
Oh dear.
one of the Legion soldiers wakes him up like 15 minutes later, and he has to rush over, and the officer's not impressed, going, we don't tolerate tardiness here.
No, I can imagine.
Yeah, so anywho, so he's put in charge of the machine gun platoon this time, so a bit different to being in the cavalry. And yeah, so in his platoon, he's got 2 different teams that he's nominally in charge of. And there's a small excerpt where he describes sort of life in the Legion. So this is page 91. This is towards the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
The legionaries, like their officers, were all volunteers. Some were attracted by the prospects of adventure and danger, which this fuerza de choc, that's a shock troops in English, for those who don't know, provided, others by the better pay and food, others by the esprit de corps and the extra latitude allowed to legionaries when off duty. The majority were impelled to join by a combination of them all. A few had signed on for 5 years, others for free, but most of them were for the duration of the war. Pay for officers and other ranks alike was about double that of the regular army. Food was incomparably better. The usual midday and evening meals consisted of soup, followed by fish or pasta, a main dish of meat, and pudding or cheese with wine and coffee. Moreover, the food was extremely well cooked. At the depots of Ceuta and Melilla, it was served to the men on china plates by waiters in white coats. The officers had the same rations as the men, supplemented by a few luxuries bought out of their pay. And Spanish troops, when well led and properly disciplined. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Go on. If you finish reading, I'll let you.
Yeah, so Spanish troops, when well led and properly disciplined, show superb qualities of courage and endurance. It was the pride of the Legion that it developed those qualities to their full. From the moment he joined, it was impressed on the recruit that he belonged to a corps apart, the finest fighting force. He was taught to believe in the world. It was up to him to prove himself worthy of the privilege. Battle was the purpose of his life. Death in action was his greatest honour. Cowardice the ultimate disgrace. The motto of the Legion was Viva la muerte. It is easy for more phlegmatic nations to deride this cult of death, but it's essentially in keeping with the Spanish character, and it produced the best soldiers of the Civil War. Men virtually impervious to cold and hunger, danger and fatigue. As an Englishman, I can only say that the thrill of serving with and commanding such troops was one of the greatest experiences of my life. The turning out and bearing of the legionary, whether his bandera or on leave, was expected to be and was far superior to that of other units. The greatest freedom was allowed to him when off duty. He was taught to take pride in his individuality. His full official designation was Caballero Legionario, Gentleman Legionary. In contrast, discipline on duty and the field was extremely strict, even savage by English standards. Orders were executed at the double and usually reinforced by threats or imprecations. The slightest hesitation, laxity, or inefficiency was punished on the spot by a series of blows across the face and shoulders from the fusta, a pliant switch made from a bull's pistol, which was carried by all officers and sergeants. More serious or persistent defaulters were sent to the Pelotón de Castigo, or punishment squads, where they toiled at the most exhausting tasks from before dawn until well after dark under the command of a corporal, usually chosen for his ferocity. In this mobile glasshouse, food was meagre, beatings frequent and severe. A dirty rifle was enough to earn a man a month in the peloton. Insubordination, whether or not in the face of the enemy, was punishable by death on the spot. So as you can see, they are extremely brutal discipline.
Well, a couple of things to go into context here. So first of all, part of the reason that discipline was so high, this may get me in trouble, but I think that, different nations, different people, different ethnicities need different standards. And, it wasn't too long ago we abolished flogging in the army, and there's a great line in the 1968 Charge of the Light Brigade film where this officer character says, there's one that goes sort of, oh, flogging is so evil, we should get rid of it. And the other one goes, you can't expect the men to fight if they aren't flogged to it. What do you expect them to do? Fight for money? That would be unchristian, this kind of attitude. And of course, I do think that the Spanish character just sort of requires that kind of hard discipline. The men aren't going to fight unless they're whipped and shot to it. And I mean,
they are mates after all.
Yes, I know, and that execution on the spot, that would have come from the Rif War, where the unit was formed. It was a colonial war in Morocco in the early 20s, which was brutal, and the Spanish army, the original sort of badly trained, corrupt, conscript Spanish army, suffered some tremendously humiliating losses. For example, at the Battle of Anwar, where an entire army of about 13,000 was routed and panicked and completely wiped out by about 3,000 Moroccans. Utter disaster. So this is the atmosphere in which the Spanish Legion is created. I mean, that death on the spot thing. If in the heat of a colonial war like that, an officer went to a man and said, do this or that, and he hesitated or was insubordinate, then he would pull out the pistol and shoot him, like it says, be dead on the spot if you didn't obey the order, because it's not just bloodthirstiness. It's that if you get hesitation or insubordination in a war like that, the whole unit, the whole battle, the whole army is at risk. It only takes one hesitant soldier, one insubordinate man to hold up a whole battalion. So it was that kind of hard life. You hesitate to obey my order, you're going to get shot, kind of thing.
And brutal, but
sorry, go on.
Yeah, brutal but necessary. I hate to have this thought, but this is making me think a little bit of the Soviets, Order 227, no step back, where they would just shoot anybody who didn't obey orders. But then I don't feel that's an entirely fair comparison.
I would say it's not a fair comparison on the grounds that what the Soviet blocking troops actually did was quite different to how they're often portrayed. There's that really outrageous film, Enemy at the Gates, that everyone's seen, and everybody has this. Well, basically, everybody has this sort of image in their minds that the way the Russians fought the Second World War was by sending waves of half-armed men without training or bullets or guns into German machine gun fire, with a kind of commissar at the back who would shoot you if you tried to retreat. It wasn't like that. The purpose of the NKVD blocking troops or blocking detachments was more a kind of stabilization force. It was because if the Germans panicked a unit or managed to sort of break through the line, the blocking troops would round up men who had been isolated or were fleeing or had got panicked, and basically turn them around and send them back into battle. But this wasn't like, I'm going to hold a pistol in your face and force you back in. It could be like that, but most of the time it was just, right, we've got a bunch of men running through a field away from the Germans. What unit are they from? Do they have their weapons? How shall we send them back to the front line, basically? But it wasn't quite the same low level, almost kind of barbarian level discipline that you get in the Spanish Legion, where you disobey an order, you get shot. I think in the Soviet army, even in the most brutal periods of it, you would at least get a court-martial before you were shot for disobeying orders. You might just be killed on the spot. I want to sorry.
So in some way, the Spanish Royal Legion was even more brutal than the Soviets.
I mean, of course, the context of war is very different. The Spanish Legion was never in quite as desperate of a struggle as the whole Soviet army was. But no, I would say on the level of the individual soldier, the discipline in the Legion was harsher, or it had the reputation for being harsher.
And for what Kemp's described, though, they probably had a much better standard of living than the average Soviet soldier would have.
Very much so. I mean, as we heard just then, one of the great perks of joining the Legion versus the regular army was that you got access to quite a lavish selection of food and off time, and you could kind of get away with whoring around in the brothels and philandering and drinking. And a blind eye would be turned by the authorities because you were a legionary, a gentleman legionnaire. And, if you're going to have somebody who's that who's willing to live up to the standards of that unit, you can allow him a little bit of off time, can't you? Just on the point about food, one of the great advantages the nationalists had when they started the war was that they captured all the main agricultural regions. So they had pretty much the entire grain supply, for example. And not only that, but they were basically given huge amounts of supplies on credit by various American financiers and corporations whose interests did not involve a communist victory in Spain. And what this meant was that, on the one hand, if you lived in a city that had been taken in the coup on the first day, life went on as normal. Cafes were still open, restaurants were open, hotels are open, the shops are full of food. Rationing doesn't really come into effect till later in the war in those areas. If it does, it's fairly light because all the infrastructure is still there. So for some sort of middle-class Spaniards in the rear of the nationalist lines, their lives are just as they were. You know, the war isn't really happening to them. Whereas on the Republican side, partly because they tried to do this kind of leftist Marxist collectivization stuff, partly because they were holding on to the less agriculturally rich areas, partly because the Soviets were quite appallingly bad at getting them supplies. This meant that there was always a food shortage. Men were always starving. Men were always killing each other over scraps of food. Civilians were going hungry. Rationing didn't work. The Communist Party agents tended to embezzle food and supplies. You know, it was an utter chaotic mess when it came to the actual sort of roots of logistics. You know, and the hard fact of war is it doesn't matter how committed you are to your cause. An army marches on its stomach. The best soldier you've got is no good if you haven't fed him. You know. And there's actually a brilliant book called The Victorious Counter-Revolution, which is the economic argument for Franco's victory. And it goes into great statistical depth about how the nationalists controlled the food supplies and grain supplies, and they were very, very disciplinarian in making sure that peasants stayed on the farms and kept working. You know, and kept the harvest coming in, kept the food going around, kept the roads open. You know, they were very harsh on that. If you were caught tampering with commercial food supplies in the nationalist zone, you were going to be shot or other things like that. You know, it was you know, they had to keep that going because they knew how important it was, and they also knew how badly the Republicans were doing. They knew that half the Republican army was cold and starving. And one unit up in somewhere in Navarre, I think, up in the north of the country during a particularly cold, wet winter, the nationalist unit on that section of the frontier was eating enormously well. You know, like it was. I remember reading about the menu they had every night. I mean, it was really quite something. These men were eating for Spain, you know, in their encampment every night. But the Republicans, just a few feet over the line in the trenches opposite them, were starving. So one of their tactics was that they would get a loudspeaker or a radio out every night, and they would broadcast their dinner menu to these starving Republican troops. And before long, hundreds of Republicans were deserting and coming over the line to join the nationalist side because they were just hungry. They were hungry, and they were just hearing about this luscious food menu that was being served every night in the nationalist encampment. So, you know, and I believe the nationalists repeated that tactic quite successfully all over the frontier during the war. They would just broadcast their dinner menus available to their troops every single day. Very effective when you're a tired, starving Republican whose sort of communist communist officer is embezzling all the food and is, you know, keeping you hungry. So yeah,
and going back to the Soviet influence, I mean, I don't think this is particularly innovative, but you know, I think Stalin was more interested in interfering in the internal politics of the republic than actually helping them win the war.
That's true.
Because he helped the their agents helped the Communist Party of Spain purge the POUM, or the party that Orwell was affiliated with when he
That's
went
right.
to go fight for them. Because I've not read,
Also, your microphone has gone a little bit quiet there. I don't know if you moved away from it or something.
Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you. It's a bit quieter than what it was.
I'm sorry. I'll lean forward. Is that better?
That should be fine. Yes. Anyway, sorry. Go
on. Yes, because I've not read En Marche for Catalonia, but I know Orwell describes his experience, and from what I've heard, it's pretty brutal how the communists went and cracked down on the POUM, because they were Trotskyite, weren't they?
That's right. Yes, the leftists did much of the work for their own destruction. Yes, though it must be said that Stalin's questionable support and often deliberate wrecking of the Republican faction or factions was partly a strategic consideration, because he didn't want he knew in a sort of Machiavellian level that he didn't want a revolution in Spain to succeed, because if that happened, a lot of the diplomacy work that he had done in the 20s and 30s to establish warmer relations between capitalist Europe and the Soviet Union would be for nothing, because immediately everybody would ally against communism, because they would say, look, the Soviet Union is actively funding revolutions in other countries. Whereas, of course, Stalin's policy, famously, when he battled against Trotsky, was he wanted socialism in one country. He wasn't interested in wars abroad. He didn't want to go spreading revolutions everywhere. He wanted to focus on consolidating the gains made in the Soviet Russia and the other territories. So, and also, of course, a revolution in Spain would be a liability, because Spain has a very militant communist sector to it, but you've also got deeply Catholic, reactionary conservatives all over the place. Even if they were able to establish a kind of red state, it would be an enormous liability to try and keep running. It would be too much of a headache. It would probably fail. He didn't really want Spain to turn red per se at that moment. He knew in his rational mind that it wouldn't be advantageous at that moment.
And because it's on the other side of Europe, he wouldn't be able to easily. Whereas later with the Warsaw Pact, if one of them revolt, you just march the tanks in. But
territorial continuity.
The countries the other side of the continent.
Yes, and of course also he would rather have Spain be anti-communist than have it be Trotskyist. So that was why he was often deliberately encouraging, or him and the Politburo and the International were discouraging Trotskyist elements and often sabotaging them deliberately with greater zeal than they fought the nationalists. In fact, I believe by the end of the war, most leftists were perfectly happy to live under Franco, as long as the opposing leftist factions weren't in charge. They would rather have Franco in charge than the Trotskyists or whatever.
The leftists eternally bickering.
It's a perfect guidebook to how to lose a civil war. Is the Republican faction, basically?
Because you've got liberals, socialists, anarchists, and communists all trying to do what they call it, the Popular Front governments.
Yes, and they're all hungry and corrupt. So no one's getting any food, no one's getting any supplies. They're not winning any battles. If it doesn't matter what as I said, it doesn't matter what your principles are. If your men are sat there cold and hungry with corrupt officers and no real sense of unified leadership, you're doomed.
Of course. Well, that was a very interesting sort of tangent, but I just want to go back to Kemp now. There's another anecdote from the book where he describes the discipline of the Legion. So this is on page 105.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Towards the second half of the page. So it was my turn to supervise the company's midday rancho, I was standing by the cauldron in the corner of the village square. The men lined up in a double queue in front of me, the subteniente and the brigada, or the CQMS, looking on from a distance. Having tasted the food and given the order to carry on, I was watching the distribution when I heard the subteniente break into a gabble of rage, and out of the corner of my eye, saw him advance on one of the men at the end of the line. At first, I paid no attention, being used to his behaviour by now. A moment later, I heard the sound of blows as he laid into the man, followed by an angry shout. When I reached the scene, I found the subteniente, flushing and quivering with temper, standing in front of a legionary whose face bore the look of defiance, and whose cap was lying on the ground, where the subteniente had knocked it. "Pick it up," shouted the subteniente. "I will not," growled the man. "You're under arrest," I snapped at him. "You and you." I called to two of the other men. "Escort him to the vigilancia. Subteniente, will you please make a report in writing on this incident?" When I told Almanac, he was indignant. "Did you not have a pistol?" "I had," I said the subteniente for that matter. "Well, why didn't you shoot the fellow then and there? That's how we deal with insubordination in the Legion. Now we'll have a court-martial on our hands. I wondered if I should ever make a Legion officer."
Yes, it's a good illustration, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think it just shows Kemp's sort of English mentality. Not to say the English people can't be disciplined. It's just I'm going to say, because while we're talking about the Spanish Civil War, I have read bits of Stanley Payne's History of Spain and Portugal, and something I noticed when he's commenting on Spanish history, especially in the 19th century, where it's all very chaotic and you've got extremes on both sides, both right and left. He tries to be impartial, but I always just detect just a little bit of disdain in how he writes. And I think, because he's American, and obviously we talk about Kemp is English, but I think in the kind of Anglo-American mindset, there seems to be this kind of default moderation and disdain for extremism. Would you agree?
Yes. Very, very true. I also note. I think he's talking about prisoners that they captured who were complaining about from the Republican side, who complained about well-fed political commissars who came from Madrid or Barcelona to give them lectures on the fighting spirit or the meaning of democracy. I like that.
Yes. And so after this, so in his his early days with the Legion, most of the actions for Kemp and his company are around the city of Teruel in Aragon, which is in northeastern Spain. And this is a very rugged, mountainous, or I should say, most of Spain is rugged and mountainous, but Aragon particularly because it's near the Pyrenees. Yes. And it's during the winter as well, because it's January and February, and it's absolutely bitterly cold during this time. And to make it worse, Kemp describes a friendly fire incident where some of the nationalist owned bombers kill about 500 casualties of their own side within about 5 minutes.
Yes. Very, very common incident during this war.
Yeah, because later on there's an incident involving some, I think it's anti-aircraft guns as well.
Yes, friendly fire comes up a lot, partly because the Spanish army is on the whole not so professional. It's a civil war, so there's a lot of incidents early on like that. Also, the fact that kind of aerial warfare is being pioneered here. The kind of attacks we see in World War II were all kind of dress rehearsed in the Spanish Civil War. So there's a lot of trial and error happening. Kind of aiming of bombs and things like that. So yes, it's not the first incident I've read about. As I said.
And you've got to bear in mind here, it's a war where both sides speak the same language, so there's apt to be some confusion, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so after this, Kemp, he is transferred to a new platoon, and because after they successfully relieved Teruel, Franco launches his it's called the Mediterranean offensive, where there's a big push to sweep across Aragon and Catalonia to cut Barcelona off from the rest of the Republicans. And it's at this moment that it's pretty much seen as the nationalists have won the war, because they've now, Madrid and Barcelona are cut off from each other, and a lot of Republican troops are now stuck in the northeast of the country.
Yes, that's right. Completely cut into two.
And it's from this point that we get to probably the most, I think, grim section of the book, where it talks about how the Spanish Foreign Legion were incredibly brutal and disciplinarian, but Kemp witnesses some executions. So I'm actually going to read a couple of excerpts from this. So this is page 134. Let me just find my place. Right, so the following day remains in my memory for one of the most horrible incidents in my experience. The horror of it is still with me as I write now, nor, I fear, will it ever leave me. I can scarcely bear to write of it now. At noon the next day, we were still resting on our cliff top when I was ordered to report to Chancellor. I found him talking with some legionaries who had brought him a deserter from the International Brigades, an Irishman from Belfast. He had given himself up to one of our patrols down by the river. Chancellor wanted me to interrogate him. The man explained that he'd been a seaman on a British ship trading to Valencia, where he had got very drunk one night, missed his ship, and been picked up by the police. The next thing he knew, he was in Albacete, impressed into the International Brigades. He knew that if he tried to escape in Republican Spain, he would certainly be retaken and shot, and so he had bided his time until he reached the front. When he had taken the first opportunity to desert, he had been wandering around for 2 days before he found our patrol. I was not absolutely sure that he was telling the truth, but I knew that if I seemed to doubt his story, he would be shot, and I was resolved to do everything in my power to save his life. Translating his account to Chancellor, I urged that this was indeed a special case. The man was a deserter, not a prisoner, and would be unwise as well as unjust to shoot him. Moved either by my arguments or by my consideration for my feelings, Chancellor agreed to spare him, subject to De Mora's consent. I'd better go and see De Mora at once, while Chancellor would see that the deserter had something to eat. De Mora was sympathetic. You seem to have a good case, he said. Unfortunately, my orders from Colonel Pena Redonda are to shoot all foreigners. If you can get his consent, I'll be delighted to let the man off. You'll find the colonel over there, on the highest of those hills. Take the prisoner with you, in case there are any questions, and your 2 runners are as escorts. It was an exhausting walk of nearly a mile, with the midday sun blazing on our backs. Does it get any hotter in this country? The deserter asked as we panted up the steep sides of a ravine, the sweat pouring down our faces and backs. You haven't seen the half of it yet. Wait another 3 months, I answered, wondering grimly whether I should be able to win him even another 3 hours of life. I found Colonel Pena Redonda sitting cross-legged with a plate of fried eggs on his knee. He greeted me amiably enough as I stepped forward and saluted. I had taken care to leave my prisoner well out of earshot. I repeated his story, adding my own plea at the end, as I had with Chancellor and De Mora. I have the fellow here, sir, I concluded, in case you wish to ask him any questions. The colonel did not look up from his plate. No, Peter, he said casually, his mouth full of egg. I don't want to ask him anything. Just take him away and shoot him. I was so astonished that my mouth dropped open, my heart seemed to stop beating. Pena Redonda looked up, his eyes full of hatred. Get out, he snarled. You heard what I said. As I withdrew, he shouted to me, I warn you, I intend to see that this order is carried out. Motioning the prisoner and escort to follow, I started down the hill. I would not walk with them, for I knew that he would question me, and I could not bring myself to speak. I decided not to tell him until the last possible moment, so that at least he might be spared the agony of waiting. I even thought of telling him to try and make a break for it, while I distracted the escort's attention. Then I remembered Pena Redonda's parting words, and looking back, saw a pair of legionaries following us at a distance. I was so numb with misery and anger that I didn't notice where I was going until I found myself in the front of De Mora once more. When I told him the news, he bit his lip. Then I'm afraid there's nothing we can do, he said gently. You had better carry out the execution yourself. Someone has got to do it, and it will be easier for him to have a fellow countryman around. After all, he knows that you tried to save him. Try and get it over quickly. It was almost more than I could bear to face the prisoner, where he stood between my 2 runners. As I approached, they dropped back a few paces, leaving us alone. They were good men and understood what I was feeling. I forced myself to look at him. I'm sure he knew what I was going to say. I've got to shoot you. A barely audible "oh my god" escaped him. Briefly, I told him how I tried to save him. I asked him if he wanted a priest or a few minutes by himself, if there were any messages he wanted me to deliver. Nothing, he whispered. Please make it quick. That I can promise you. Turn around and start walking straight ahead. He held out his hand and looked me in the eyes, saying only, "Thank you. God bless you," I murmured. As he turned his back and walked away, I said to my two runners, "I beg you to aim true. He must not feel anything." They nodded and raised their rifles. I looked away. The two shots exploded simultaneously. "On our honour, sir," the senior of the two said to me, "he could have not have felt a thing." I went to examine the body. There was no doubt the death had been instantaneous. When we had buried him, I reported to the councillor, who said, "The Commandante has asked me to give you this message. He wishes you to know that he deeply regrets the shooting of that Englishman, that he considers it a crime, and that the responsibility for it must forever rest upon the conscience of that," he spat the word "gentleman." "You know, he went so far as to send a pair of legionaries after you to shoot you if you did not immediately carry out his order. That is something we shall none of us forget." He looked hard at me. "We are all sorry, Peter."
It's really a just torturous moment, isn't it?
Yes, as I said, I think that is the darkest moment in the entire book.
Absolutely. Yes, it's
what comes to my mind is
go on.
Sorry, well, I'm loath to quote Cromwell, but what was it? War is hell.
Well, yes, but also just it doesn't even really speak so much of war, just the kind of pointless pettiness of it. I mean, the guy, this man's life resting entirely on the mood of some officer who is nominally in charge of what happens. Everybody else totally sympathetic, just wants to see this guy on his way so they can get on with whatever they're doing. And the one man who could make that happen officially is bloodthirsty enough to insist he be shot and sending men after him to make sure that it happens. Terrible.
Yes, it seems tad sadistic.
It also really, really makes me wish that we could get a film adaptation of this book by a competent writer and director. That would be quite something, wouldn't it?
Yes, I would love to see it, but I don't think it will happen because it's too sympathetic to the nationalists.
You never know. maybe one day when we're all in charge, we'll get it made.
Yes. And so after this, before this long reading, there's a couple of other examples of there's one that's like this quite a sadistic German volunteer in the Legion who is really, they need somebody to execute someone that they found, and it's like a Republican officer, and this German is like drooling and jumping at the bit to like execute someone, and you think, look, I know it's a war, but you don't need to get like hard on for just killing people.
But you will. I think the military in general attracts those kinds of characters, doesn't it?
I suppose so.
You always have somebody who's bloodthirsty and in the ranks, I suppose.
Yes, and so after this, the unit goes into probably one of the hardest fought engagements Kemp ever has to experience, and it's actually against a unit of British member of the International Brigade, whose commander Kemp actually later has to liaise with when he's in the SOE.
Yes.
Yes, and so it's a very heavy fighting. Kemp also gets significantly wounded because he gets shot in the arm, and there's a moment where he very valiantly goes up onto a hill and tries to rally the troops by waving the flag, but he ends up getting blasted backwards into a trench.
Yes, that's right.
And then there's a moment where, so after this they withdraw, and there's a moving about in the war for a bit more after some more operations. And so I mentioned there's the AA friendly fire incident that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So he goes on leave for a couple of months until May 1938. And then what happens in July is he has an incident where he's talking to, I think it's Chancellor in the trench, and then a grenade flies down into the trench off to his left, and which goes off. Chancellor's fine, but Kemp's jaw is very badly shattered. I mean,
That's right.
it must have been far enough away, because I'm surprised that didn't kill him outright. So it must have been
Well,
far enough away.
It's part of the series of injuries that in the end gets him sent home, isn't it? Because he basically is too battered to keep fighting.
Yes, this injury basically knocks him out of commission for the rest of the war, which carries on until April 1939. So his jaw is shattered, so he's in recuperation. Because when he first gets injured and he's sent to the doctor, he's lying on a stretcher with like flies crawling over his wounds for hours, and it's implied by the sort of the surgeon that if they'd not sent him in like the next ambulance, there's a chance he probably would have died.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's another one of those close shaves.
Yes.
And so after months of being moved around to different hospitals, he has to keep having surgery because bits of metal and like plastic and other shit are just like stuck inside his like wounds, and so they have to keep being stitched up and removed and cleansed. And he spends time in several different hospitals. And what's interesting is these hospitals are like tended by nuns, and the nuns insist on like serving him coffee at 2 a.m.
Yes. Well, it's yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yes, and there's an amusing incident where there's a German officer who's also being having been recuperated, who like swears violently every time he gets woken up by the nuns, and then one time he pulls out his gun and like blows the light out in the room.
Yes, that's right. The hospital does get a bit comedic in a dark way. But that point about all the bits of metal in him, I mean, one of the great horrors of modern war, if you get grazed by shell fire or such, is that you just get showered with all these tiny bits of metal and all sorts of dirt and things like that. There was an account I was reading recently of a soldier in the First World War who was he was standing with his back to a shell explosion that knocked him forwards, and he was fine, but his back was in agony, and they couldn't work out why, because his bones and muscles were fine. He had some bruising, but that was about it. And he kept complaining of this horrible pain. And then that night, hit the skin on his back basically pushed out all of these thousands and thousands of tiny bits of dirt and earth and metal and rock that it was so finely embedded in his skin they couldn't see them. And then overnight, his skin sort of forced them out as it healed. And his bed and his shirt were just full of this sort of heap of metal powder sort of thing. It's horrible. You know, you can imagine what that must feel like.
Oh, it must be dreadful.
I mean, I once not that this is anything comparable to how that would feel, but I once had some very nasty, very small wooden splinters in my leg, and overnight they all slowly came out. And that in itself was pretty torturous, just a few little bits of wood from an old boat. So I can't even imagine what it's like to have your whole back raised with metal and earth, you know. It's just awful.
It must feel like being flogged, possibly.
Maybe.
Yep. So after much sort of rest and recuperation, towards the end of the war, what ends up happening is Franco personally gives Kemp leave to return home to England to fully rest, because the war's pretty much over by that point. And so there's a final reading I want to do, which is page 157.
Yes.
Okay. So I never doubted that my application for home leave would be granted once it came to the personal attention of General Franco. Abused by his enemies, criticised by his allies, and even by his friends, he was nevertheless, like all good commanders, devoted to the interests of his subordinates, especially the officers of the Foreign Legion, which he had helped to found. The following July, when I was passing through Burgos on my way to England, having obtained my discharge from the Foreign Legion, I was informed by the Duke of Piñajamosa that the Generalissimo wished to see me. When I had passed through the enormous gates of his headquarters, receiving an impressive salute from the Moorish guard, walked along a curving drive and climbed a flight of stone steps, I was shown into a long, dim anteroom full of heavy black furniture. After a lengthy wait, for there were several people before me, Piñajamosa escorted me through a door to a small sitting room with another door leading out of it. Knocking on this further door, he disappeared, leaving me to seat myself on a small sofa by the window. 5 minutes later, the door opened to admit a small, tubby figure, dwarfed by the broad scarlet sash and pendant gold tassels of a full general. As he came towards me with short, brisk steps, I sprang to my feet and saluted. "As sus órdenes, mi general." He told me to sit beside him then, inclining his dark, sombre face towards me, putting his hand on my knee to emphasize his words. He began to speak in one of the quietest voices I've ever heard. He talked for half an hour, practically without intermission. He'd always admired the English, he said, especially their system of education, with its emphasis on self-discipline, breeding the spirit of adventure that had made no so small a country the ruler of so great an empire. He regarded the British Empire as perhaps the greatest bulwark against communism in the world, but he doubted that British were fully alive to the communist danger. Whenever any of his friends returned to Spain from a visit to England, he made a point of examining them on all aspects of English life, political, social, and economic. It seemed to him that our universities in particular, perhaps because of their commendable anxiety to preserve intellectual freedom, were paying too little attention to the spread of subversive influences amongst our youth. Throughout the interview, his tone was informal and friendly, neither didactic nor condescending, sensitive, no doubt, to the embarrassment I should feel if I had to express my own views. He invited no comment. At the end, he rose, shook hands gravely, thanked me for my services, and wished me luck. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Join the British Army for this coming war, I suppose, Your Excellency." He cocked his head, then gave a wintry smile. "I don't think there will be a war." I wonder what he really thought.
Yes, it's you can always tell true accounts of meetings with Franco because he had a very specific character and they get it perfectly right as this account does. You know, and it's a very kind of interesting moment, isn't it? What Franco says about Britain, and then the comment about he doesn't think there'll be a war. You know, that kind of thing. I remember this the first time I read the book. It stayed with me.
I'm surprised he admired the English, because I feel most Spaniards, especially throughout history, have hated England because they saw it as a rival, and because I actually won't forget him. Have you ever read any of the Sharp novels by Bernard Cornwell?
Indeed, I have.
Do you remember it's the Major that Sharp meets in I think it's Sharp's Rifles, where he's fighting Harper, and the Major comes up, and he sort of shames them for fighting, and when he finds out that they're English, and he's really distrusting because you English, you're a race of pirates, all you do is raid and pillage.
Well, I mean, in sympathy to him, you know, they had literally been at war with each other until Napoleon invaded Spain. So,
yes,
I can understand the resentment.
And yes, it's an interesting contrast. You've got Spain, this country built upon sort of righteous, sort of religious warfare and tradition and conquest, and then you've got England, this very sort of mercantile, sort of nautical, piratical nation.
It is an interesting contrast, and as well because you know, they've both gone through quite similar things in terms of both being rising empires, and of course Britain by the 30s is, you know, just beginning its kind of imperial decline, I suppose you'd call it. or is in the early phases of it. So, and I think Franco is perfectly right when he says, as great as your institutions are, they're open to subversion. And I mean, look what's happened. We're sat here now in 2022. There's not a single institution in the country that hasn't been utterly subverted by disgusting radical ideologies.
And as you said, like, the English value the intellectual freedom. Well, that's not around anymore.
No, exactly. Whatever happened to that?
And his whole comment. That was very prophetic. The English not being wise to communism.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sad note to end on, but that's pretty much the end of the book. So, was there anything you really wanted to wrap up with at all? Or?
I would just close with a comment that says I highly recommend the book to anyone that's not read it. It reads more like a novel than a history book. And I mean, when I first read it, I read it in one sitting in an afternoon. Got through it pretty much immediately because it grabbed me. Very, very fascinating memoir and so valuable. You will learn a lot of things about what it's like to fight for a right-wing or reactionary cause. And the universal truths that go along with that as an individual experience, no matter what side or what time period you're fighting on or in. It's an utterly brilliant book that deserves 1,000 times the attention it's actually given.
Yes, absolutely. And well, that's it was pretty impressive to read that in an afternoon. But then again, it's not a particularly long book, but just shows your passion for it.
Yes. I recommend this book to everybody, basically.
Yes, and I also recommend the other two works of Kemp published by Mystery Grove, as I mentioned, No Colours or Crest and Arms for Oblivion. Because I know Kemp also wrote another autobiography later, which is, I think, called The Thorns of Memory. Mystery Grove have not published that, so maybe that's even harder to get hold of, I'm assuming.
Yes, though I believe either Mystery Grove or Imperium will probably get the rights to it at some point. So, and also there's always I know that it's been quite awkward since Z Library's gone down, but there's always things floating around out there. So I'm sure we'll it shouldn't be too difficult to find.
And right, so we had a few people comment, which was nice. So just going to allow a minute or two if anybody watching has any comment and has any questions, we'll answer them.
Okay.
We have our attention, Chaz.
I'm just reading it now. It's quite funny.
Oh yeah, the Epic Random dude. Yes, that's something that happens in the hospital. There's a moment where Kemp has to be transferred again, and I think it's a raquete officer who's quite young, actually volunteers to let Kemp go instead of him. And Kemp later says to a nurse, "Oh, I want to get thanks to that officer," and she's like, "He died," and it's like, And
yes,
feels quite guilty.
Well, this is the thing about an experience like fighting in a war like this, is that you'll encounter every facet of humanity. You'll encounter horrible, horrible people, and you'll encounter, gentlemen like that in the truest sense of the word, who quite possibly knew he was going to die and said, put him on the ambulance, not me. He needs it more than I do, really. It's once you've read this book once, it doesn't ever leave you. I mean, practically every day when I'm doing something, I recall some anecdote or bit in the book or some particularly well-written line that stuck with me. One bit that's always in the forefront of my mind is the section near the beginning where he's in one of his first combats and they're pinned down by Republican machine gun fire. And because they're stuck there in this trench with the machine gun above them, they can't bring up any fresh supplies. So the supply depot is only, it's literally within eyesight. They can see it. There's a path leading from the supply area and where there's hot food and supplies to their trench. But anybody who ventures down that path to try and get anything is just hit with a blaze of machine gun fire. And he talks about how, you know, they're all starving, they're all desperately thirsty in this sweltering Spanish heat, and they can smell the food cooking, they can see the canteens of water, and there's nothing they can do to get to it. And some men are just maddened by thirst and try and run for it, and some of them get killed, and one or two of them manage to do it. And sod's law, the only thing one of them manages to bring after this, you know, death-defying run against the machine gun is a bottle of brandy. And if you're extremely thirsty, a bottle of brandy isn't much good to you, is it? In fact, I believe Kemp says he drinks some out of desperation, then immediately curses himself because he's made himself twice as thirsty as he was now because he's taken alcohol.
Speaking of brandy, that does remind me, when he's having his treatment as well, there's no anaesthetic, so the doctor gives him a bottle of brandy, which he swigs while they're having the operation.
Yes, that's right. Well, I mean, that's what it was like, you know. If there's you have to use whatever you have. I mean, in a lot of wars, where there's no anaesthetic available, you just have to hit somebody over the head, you know, to just actually knock them out cold. That was sometimes done. Not with great, not with any great reverence, because of course you can very easily kill somebody or give them severe head trauma by doing that. But if you know what you're doing and you know how to knock somebody unconscious, then you know that's also a way to get them to sit still for the surgeon. But you know, you use whatever you've got, don't you?
Absolutely.
If I had the option of going into surgery without anesthetic or with a bottle of brandy, I'm always going to take the brandy. You know? That's something, isn't it?
Of course, yes. Okay, we've not really had any questions, so we'll wrap it up here. So,
okay.
Anything you'd like to share before we leave?
No, I've had a bit of disruption in my personal life, so things have changed now. But I've got my computer with me at last, so I should be returning to the Sunday Rambles on my channel soon. Which I think should be good. We managed to get one of them done, and hopefully we'll get some more done in the coming weekends. And I'll be making regular content again, I think. So yes, and expect various posts on my Substack as well. Or follow me on Twitter where everything gets linked. So that's pretty much it from me.
Splendid. And join me next Thursday, where hopefully I'll be having a discussion with Columba and hopefully Furious Pertinax as well. We'll be discussing Julius Caesar and Caesarism. Should be a great conversation. So thank you all for watching, and good night.
Night, everyone.